Imagine you're in Hawaii, and you've got the next month and a half off, and you want to visit Tahiti. So you book a flight, 10 hours later, you're in Tahiti. Now imagine there's no flights available, only boats. Still, you've got time and you find one that can get you there in about 2 weeks. Not bad, it'll be an adventure. Now imagine it's the year 1000 AD, before the invention of GPS or even the compass. You have a canoe, and your only map is the sky above you and the moving ocean below to cross 2,600 miles of Pacific Ocean. Still up for the trip? For thousands of years, long before Marco Polo and Columbus, Polynesian navigators made voyages that even today rank among the most impressive human conquests of the natural world. Today on Place and Time, we cover the incredible history of Polynesian navigation, its modern revival from the brink of extinction thanks to one man, and the impact of its continued tradition. Please stick around. The first thing I learned was the area known as Polynesia is huge, bounded by Hawaii in the north, New Zealand in the southwest, and Rapa Nui in the east. It forms a guitar pick-shaped 10 million square miles of ocean. And much of the history of the thousands of years of navigation that led to the settling of the Polynesian islands was oral tradition, and a lot of it was lost and replaced by European narratives. But as time went on, Westerners couldn't explain how the so-called Stone Age people could cross thousands of miles of ocean in open boats against wind and currents to locate tiny dots of land. It was inconceivable to European colonizers that they weren't the first or most skilled ocean navigators. The historical gymnastics they did to convince themselves otherwise bordered on insane. The Aryan-Polynesian theory, constructed at the end of the 19th century, reasoned that Polynesian languages were traceable back to Sanskrit, like European languages, and thus Polynesians were essentially Europeans. Ethnologist S. Percy Smith went so far as to claim the Polynesians shared, quote, intelligence, their charming personalities, and, one likes to think, their common sense with ourselves from the Caucasian branch of humanity. Another narrative came from Norwegian adventurer Thor Heyerdahl, who hypothesized that because Pacific winds blew east to west, it was likely native South Americans who colonized the Pacific in balsa wood rafts and simply drifted to the Polynesian islands, no navigation skill required. To prove his point, he built one, the Kon-Tiki, making it intentionally unsteerable, attached a sail, and drifted from Peru over 101 days and 4,300 miles across the Pacific. Making landfall in Roroya, around 460 miles north of Tahiti. He documented it in a 1948 book and later in an Academy Award-winning documentary. While it was a great adventure, in 1973 a team of computer modelers showed that the settlement of the islands of the Pacific by drift voyaging was extremely unlikely. Since then, using carbon dating, plants, language, and other archaeological evidence, the consensus true story goes something like this. About 8,000 years ago, some tribes sailed from the South China mainland to Taiwan. And around somewhere between 3000 and 1000 BC, the tribes from Taiwan started to explore the ocean to the east and south into the edges of Micronesia and Melanesia through the Philippines and Indonesia. And a distinct culture, Lapita, starts to emerge in the Bismarck Archipelago, a chain of islands near New Britain. They're great at pottery and building permanent villages along the coasts, and that's the next clue as to where they go after that, as the same pottery begins to appear 2,600 miles away in Tonga and Samoa between 1300 and 900 BC. Before 1000 AD, they've settled the Cook Islands, followed slightly later by Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, spanning a combined 10 million square miles of Pacific Ocean. This is several hundred years before Portuguese exploration of Africa, and 500 years before Columbus's first voyage to the Americas. And at the core of these incredible journeys are two key components: boats and navigators. I called those boats canoes at the beginning, but that's a huge understatement. The boats the native Polynesians built, called vahakalua, looked a lot more like modern catamarans, with massive double hulls with a deck in between and a mounted sail lashed together. They're steered by an oar from the back. The captains of these voyages were the navigators. They had to memorize everything the open ocean offered them, and then piece it together like a map. The sun was their main guide, as its rising and setting were daily and reliable. On clear evenings, they could use the stars as reference points. They would set a heading by a star near the horizon, switching to a new one once the first one rose too high. And a sequence of stars would be memorized for each route. One of the more impressive techniques was the observation of the migration paths of birds. In Harold Gatty's The Raft book, written as a survival guide for U.S. Army in World War II, he outlined how different species took different but consistent routes. So if you wanted to get to Easter Island from Mangareva, you'd follow the Sooty Turn. A voyage from Tahiti or the Cook Islands to New Zealand might have followed the migration of the long-tailed cuckoo. And that route I mentioned at the top from Tahiti to Hawaii was exactly the route of the Pacific golden plover, or the bristle-thighed curlew. And when they were close to land, it's believed some would have special birds on board for sighting the shore. If the frigate bird's feathers became wet, they're useless. So voyagers would keep one on board, release it when they thought they were close to land, and would follow it if it didn't return to the boat. They even had knowledge of the ocean swells and currents and the effects approaching islands still not in sight would have on them, or the colors of clouds that resulted from the white sand of coral atolls reflecting heat into the sky. Even the color of the sky itself could be recognized as resulting from the presence of lagoons or shallow waters, as deep water wasn't as reflective, but shallow water, such as a lagoon, might reflect a faint green color on the clouds above. They'd combine this information into these incredible maps composed of wooden sticks called rebelib, with horizontal and vertical sticks acting as supports, while diagonal and curved ones would represent the wave swells. Small shells would represent positions of the islands. Voyagers would memorize the chart before a journey, and the charts wouldn't be carried with them on the trip. I'll include a link to a few in the show notes because you absolutely have to see them to believe them. They are remarkable. If all of this sounds as incredible and beautiful as it did to me in learning it, this next part is hard. British explorer Captain James Cook arrives in Hawaii in 1778 and performs the first attempted census of the island. And at the time, there are nearly 700,000 native Hawaiians living completely sustainable lives. They value fresh water, renewable agriculture, and harmony with the natural world they called home. Within 20 years of Cook's arrival, their population is down 48% due to the same things that plagued the North American mainland native people: disease, subjugation, and violence. By 1820, it's down 71%, 1840, 84%. And by 1880, the population of native Hawaiians across all the islands is down to 22,000 people. As a result, a lot of those traditions, of which navigation was one, were forgotten, or even more tragically, outlawed. Nainoa Thompson, president of the Polynesian Voyaging Society, describes in a 2020 speech at the Ocean Sciences meeting.
1926, the public schools, by policy, would outlaw language and culture cannot be spoken or practiced in schools. Private schools, and I know, so my grandmother would tell me in these stories that teachers in private schools had the authority to beat you if you tried to speak your language. Try to remember your genealogy. The black road of extinction is being well paved in Hawaii. I believe that we were right on the edge of the cliff, because I know, so when I graduated from high school, being taught nothing about who I am, where do I come from, and knowing that I should have been taught that I come from the greatest navigators and explorers on the face of the earth.
But in 1958, a chance meeting takes place that sets in motion a series of incredibly fortunate events that make this story still tellable today. Dr. Ben Finney was a surfer and anthropologist from Santa Barbara. After serving in the Navy, he moves to Hawaii for graduate school where he meets Catherine Luamala, a folklorist, mythologist, and professor at the University of Hawaii. Again, here's Nainoa Thompson recalling what happens next.
And she gave him 2 books, and she said, read these 2 books. They're wrong. Change it. One was Kon-Tiki, that Polynesians came from the Americas, drifted around on balsa rafts. Wrong. And then there was the other one by Andrew Sharp, a world-renowned anthropologist, who said, oh, no, they had voyaging canoes, but they didn't have the intelligence to navigate more than 100 miles.
He moves back to Santa Barbara where he's teaching and building a double-hulled canoe in the style of the Vahakalua. In 1973, he moves back to Hawaii and co-founds the Polynesian Voyaging Society with artist Herb Kane and sailor Charles Tommy Holmes. They know how to build the boats, but to prove Sharp, Heyerdahl, and countless others wrong, they need to make the actual voyages. To make the voyages, they need to have that second component I mentioned earlier. They need a Polynesian navigator. And at the time, there were only 6 remaining navigators in the world, an endangered tradition of knowledge at the brink of extinction, and most of them were hesitant to speak to outsiders. Fortunately, one of them was concerned about the same thing. Pius Maupialu was born in 1932 on the small coral island of Sarawal in the Caroline Islands, a part of Micronesia. By the age of 4, he was chosen by his grandfather to study as an apprentice navigator. His entire childhood was spent learning basic navigational clues regarding the stars, swells, and birds, how to fish and build canoes from his father and grandfather, who both died before he was 16. When he was 18, Mau's aunt and uncle sent him to study with Angora, an acclaimed navigator, culminating in his initiation as a master navigator in the Wiriang School of Navigation. The induction ceremony would be the last one held on Sarawal for the next 50 years. He continued training with navigators and began making short solo voyages. Because he had a tendency to sail in all weather conditions, he was given the nickname Mau from the Sarawalese word mamau, meaning strong. He married, had 16 children, and spends the next few decades on the island of Sarawal, his home where he's navigating not for cultural preservation, but for survival. Fish were a primary source of protein for the island of only 600 people. In the late 1960s, Mau started working as a seaman on an inter-island ship run by the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. There, he meets and becomes friends with Mike McCoy, a Peace Corps volunteer stationed on Sarawal who marries his niece. They work together on a project tagging turtles. McCoy begins writing articles about these navigational techniques while keeping in touch with an acquaintance of his, Dr. Ben Finney. Mau first visits Hawaii in 1973, and McCoy introduces him to Finney, who tries to recruit him for the Hokulea project to test the hypothesis that Polynesians made intentional, non-instrumental lead voyages across the Pacific. At the time, Mau was just 41 years old and beginning to fear that traditional navigation would die in his own culture, just as it did in Hawaii. He tried to teach the young men of Sarawal the skills passed on to him, but he wasn't optimistic. The members of the younger generation were too busy with school and Western culture. So they ask Mau if he'll take this voyage with so many unknowns from Hawaii to Tahiti, a route he's never taken with a crew he's never met, and Mau says yes. On May 1st, 1976, with Captain Kawiki Kapahulahula, Mau is the navigator, Dr. Ben Finney and a crew of 12 others on board. The Hokulea, built with wood, fiberglass, and resin at 61 feet 5 inches long and able to carry 11,000 pounds of gear, supplies, and crew, powered by a 540 square foot sail area and steered with only a long paddle and no auxiliary motor, set sail from Honolulu Bay in Maui, Hawaii. Her name means Star of Gladness, which refers to Arcturus, a guiding zenith star for Hawaiian navigators. It passes directly overhead at Hawaii's latitude, helping sailors find the island. Here again is Nainoa Thompson eloquently describing the route they'd take and the cultural milestone the journey represented.
Two biggest wind systems in the world are consistent northeast trade winds, southeast trade winds, collide on the equator. You have high evaporation rate with direct sunlight, cloudiest and rainiest place on Earth. And you're navigating just by nature. Stars, sun, moon, planets, wave, wind, bird. Everything is in nature. The question is, can you see it? Can you feel it? If you're trying to contemplate from Waikiki Beach, trying to imagine looking at Tahiti, make an angle from the west side of Tahiti to the east side, it's less than one angle, one degree. And just steer there by nature. And that blue line is our road. This is our road. It's called Keala I Kahiki, pathway to and from Tahiti. Our ancestors went back and forth along this road. It's our cultural heritage. It's our road. And Mao is going to give it back to us.
On June 4th, 1976, the ship arrives in Tahiti with 17,000 Tahitians greeting them at the shore. Nainoa Thompson, who was in the crowd in Tahiti and joins the crew on the return voyage, describes it best.
Everything would change, not immediately, but the story would get out to the biggest nation on earth. What it started to do, it started to take this kind of very negative economic and health and education statistics that Native Hawaiians are the worst in their homeland, that Native Hawaiians are going to be more destined to fail more than to succeed. It's our story. When we knew that Mao allowed us to believe and to dream that we come from great navigators, then you see bumper stickers, you see T-shirts, you hear language. And it's the birth of the beginning of Renaissance. They call it the Hawaiian Renaissance.
It changes Hawaiian education. In 1985, 9 years from the first voyage, there were less than 100 native fluent Hawaiian speakers. As of 2020, there are more than 30,000. It changes policy and law, with Hawaii taking big strides to protect what was left of the undeveloped environment. And Nainoa Thompson builds a school and starts a mission to take the hokulea around the world, to deliver a message, beyond keeping this incredible tradition of skill and knowledge alive, but also to promote a sustainable oneness with nature. Since that first voyage in 1976, the hokulea has made over 13 voyages as far north as Alaska, east to the United States, and west to Japan, basically the entire Pacific Ocean. And from 2003 to 2007, they visited the rest of the world. They met with Desmond Tutu in South Africa. They visit NASA, the Statue of Liberty, and through Panama, with 322 crew members and 34 crew changes. And they're doing educational outreach at schools, getting policymakers to commit to pledges to protect the ocean, their roads, their tradition. As for what's next, they're building a new map of the world, an inverse of the maps you usually see that include land as the protagonist and ocean the great unknown antagonist, an obstacle. You can learn more at the link in the show notes, along with a link to the full speech from Nainoa Thompson you heard clips from, and a link to the documentary Papa Mau, The Wayfinder, which has some incredible footage from the 1976 Hokulea journey. I'll include a donation link in the show notes to the Polynesian Voyaging Society, of which Nainoa Thompson is the current president. Please, if you feel compelled, donate to this direct effort at preserving and expanding this incredible cultural legacy. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Well, Diane moved in, so we just get out of there. Yeah. Right. So.
Hey, John.
How's it?
Everything, the crew is up and up on the trip. They're eager to learn, eager to do everything. It's fantastic.
Mai taito mai. Atau wa hiti noa.